Michael, thanks so much for taking the time. It's good to see you. And before we jump into Web3 gaming and VR and AR and all of these things that you have going on, tell us a little bit more about yourself. What's your background story, kind of simplified version, because I know that your CV is pretty full of different experiences.
Sure. So I am a serial entrepreneur, and I basically funded a lot of my early startups because you hear these stories like most people, their early startups, they do marginally well, but they're not good enough to earn a living off of. So I supplemented those by working as a technical director for a lot of the creative agencies in New York City. And we were doing experiential with mobile devices. And after doing that for a number of years, in 2014, I started thinking about what's really going to be the next frontier as iPads and iPhones were just so widely adopted. It wasn't really the frontier anymore. And I set my sight on VR and AR. And I figured the best way to get into that, long story short, would be to find a research lab that was really pushing the boundaries and help them spin out some stuff from the research lab. I organized some conferences and events, and I spent from 2016 to 2021 in 3D VR AR research lab at NYU, spinning out a lot of the research that we were all working on there as startups, as papers, as just interesting productions. And in 2021, during the pandemic, I left the lab and co-founded a web3 company, which we can talk about today. It's also in the 3D graphics space.
Awesome, man. Definitely, I want to discuss that. What actually inspired you to get into Web3? Like, what is the connection there with the stuff that you were doing in the VR lab and you were spinning out all of these different things and building these technologies and the research? And then like you stumble upon Web3 and you're like, hey, there is something. What was that aha moment for you? Or what was that motivation for you to take all the knowledge, experience and bring it into Web3?
So we were doing a couple interesting things in the research lab where we were working with procedurally generated content that allowed for basically like an infinite number of variations of the content to be experienced in 3D. And we were trying to make that accessible, both accessible to artists and accessible to implementing in a variety of 3D experiences. So basically make it easy to create and easy to deploy. You can imagine there's a lot of different techniques you can use to make things easy. And one of the things that we kept going back and forth in is, well, do we want to teach the artists how to write code, or is there another way to show the artists how to program? So at the lab, I discovered a love for Unreal Engine, which lets artists basically go in and drag and drop like workflow diagrams to make interactive experiences and games, which some people call node-based design, where you're using nodes. Some people call it visual programming, but it's essentially a way for artists to make things without coding. And I really thought that there was something there in the creator tools space for Web3 to build, because that tech, even in the game engines space, is still under very active development. So I thought if there's some way we can bring this type of activity to Web3, where there's even more of a need, more of an opportunity to make this type of generative content and make that more accessible artists, make that more accessible to games, that we'd be onto something. And I had really no clue how to connect the dots there, how we were going to do it. But I thought like, well, this seems like a big enough problem space that we'll be able to build something somehow that would be helpful here. And I had probably 50 bad ideas before I actually stumbled on what we actually built. It was basically like, there should be a problem here. It seems like there's a problem here. Bridges will need to be built and tools will need to be made to build those bridges. That's like kind of where I like to focus when I'm building startups in the frontier.
Makes total sense to me. And it's interesting, right? Because we're living in a world today. And I think when we first met, which is a couple years back, we met in China for the first time. And then you went to do different things. I think back then it wasn't really that crazy with all of these like generative art or kind of like these DALLs and these kinds of AI tools. Like probably people were working on it back then, but it wasn't really accessible to like a normal person like myself, that I cannot log in and cannot start using it. But basically today we live in a world where we're in abundance of these tools. And basically, I even sent you this link before that Canva just announced. I saw it on LinkedIn somewhere. Somebody posted about it, that they announced that they're going to do text to image, right? Inside of their tool that is already simplifying the design process and making it possible that somebody like me can be a designer, right? Which wasn't possible before because I wouldn't learn how to use a PS, because unless you do it as a full-time job or unless you have a passion for it, you're probably not going to spend the time to do so. But now we're living in this world that like these tools are really helping you to do much more. And so I want to get your perspective on this. Obviously, this is something that you are also doing. What do you see this space evolving into in the next 1 or 2 years? Do you feel that like this AI in creativity or supporting creativity of people is just going to be everywhere and we cannot live without it in a sense? Or what's going to happen in the space?
It's a really interesting thing to think about, right? So in the professional creative world, if you look at how concept art is made that might make its way into a game or into a movie or into any type of thing where things need to be storyboarded out, what used to be the process just a year ago is the creative director would kind of shutter themselves off into a room and close the door, close the shutters, no distraction, and then just like sketch some things out, go on Google Images, search for a whole bunch of reference art that they could piece together into a mood board, right? Where they would have things that they would then bring to the team that they could present to their team and say, okay, guys, here's how I think we should start the storyboarding process, the creative process for this project. And so it would be that iterative process. And like most of these ideas would wind up like figuratively crumpled up and thrown in the trash, right? But the artifact would be this mood board. Now, what creative teams are already doing for like the last couple of months is that instead of having this mind meld with Google image search looking for reference art that probably never makes it into the final project, but can inspire the team to say, I want some of this style, I want this aesthetic, I want like that, I want like that. They're using tools like Stable Diffusion or Midjourney to generate some of this reference art, which can inspire the final project. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that being used across industry, across other fields in this content AI space. And even like when I'm coding, when I'm writing code, Microsoft has deployed a content AI model called GitHub Copilot, which it'll search GitHub, all of the open source repositories, and it'll look at your code, it'll analyze the file, and it'll predict what you're trying to do based on like how you name a function. It's almost like when you're writing an email in Gmail, how it might in dimmer text suggest the end of your sentence. This can suggest an entire function or like the next statement that you might write. And do you know what? It gets it right. Like it gets it pretty good most of the time. I mean, you're still driving, but it's like a form of cruise control or like lane shifting. It helps you free up your mind because I'm not good at keeping so many things in my mind at once. Some people are. I'm not good at that. I need to have notes. I have like different tabs and browser windows open that I'm cross-referencing things. Like I just can't keep it all in my head. I know what I need and I know where to get it, but I can't keep it in my head. So like it's kind of like it helps you with that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for these content AI companies to help people do things faster. People who are experts and know what they want to build. So it's good for experienced people. And it's also good for people who are just learning the ropes because there are rails there not to go off of. And so they don't get stuck in these rabbit holes. I like it in those ways. Downsides are that it does kind of glom things together and it says like, hey, here's the template, here's the kit. But in my experience in building things, I like starting with a template and a kit. And then I like also being able to take it all apart and put it back together in a different way. I think that being able to take toys apart and put them back together is like, that's how I grew up my whole life, taking apart toys and putting them back together differently.
I'm actually so blown away because I'm not an engineer, I'm not a coder, so I didn't even know about this GitHub thing, but it makes so much sense. And I actually, why I'm so bullish on this, I obviously understand that if you are like a professional software engineer, you have been studying this, you have been doing it for 20 years, like you will always be able to do stuff better, and you will have much more flexibility to actually build something amazing rather than using templates. And like you can literally just like drag and drop and have some functionality within a couple hours. But obviously the functionality is not really serving every single purpose, right? But what makes me super excited about is, as you're talking about it, is this can be an amazing gateway for people to get a taste for coding, to get a taste for how to build something. Because most of the time, and I would even reference it back to like when I was studying Chinese, right? Like when you have no knowledge whatsoever and you're put in front of this huge challenge, you're like, fuck it. Like, I'm never going to be able to accomplish that goal because it's too big, right? But once you start separating it into small different tasks that you can attack and you can master those, and then you kind of get motivation from the progress you're making, and you want to go deeper and you want to get better and you want to study more. You want to get better at this, even though at the beginning it sounds like, shit, I will never be able to do this because it's kind of like an alien type of thing, right? And I think that's for most of the people, it's coding, right? Even for me, right? Like I would love to be able to code something, but it's just something that I've never really been exposed to. And it just feels like it's too overwhelming. But with these kinds of tools, I think it's going to inspire people to lean in, to maybe try something out, to do something, to see the progress, to see the result of their work. And then they're going to say like, hell yes, I'm going to go deeper and I'm going to learn how to do this properly, right? So this is something that really makes me excited about these things. And I'm so happy that these things exist.
I would also add on to that like programming without code is very real, and you can build things, and the infrastructure for that is improving. Because what I think is also difficult and challenging with programming is that so many people are just really good at defining logic systems and workflows for getting things done, and can break that down and can explain it to other people and can design it on a chalkboard. But when it comes to representing these visual ideas as words, it becomes a challenge because you're using a different part of your brain and it takes you out of the flow. And I have small children, so the technical, you forget this as an adult, but the technical details of gripping a pencil and putting that down on a piece of paper to form letters, which form words, which you need to get between two lines. That's a very tedious process when you're first using like to operate those fine motor skills, and then everything that goes on up here to translate that. So meanwhile, with visual programming, you can watch a YouTube video and you're just clicking on the screen, dragging things from one place to another. And for an experienced programmer that writes code, that might be a little bit more time consuming. But for someone who's learning the ropes, all of the ideas, the functions, what's going to do what, it's just represented visually. So it's much easier to grasp because you're just dealing with the concepts and linking everything up, which in essence is what a coder does. So you're dealing with the concepts, you're linking everything up, but you're typing the code to do it, to talk to the computer instead of visually doing it. So it's the same strategy, different tactics to get it done. But I think you don't have to switch the parts of your brain that you're using as much. So I love that Unreal lets people program in this way. Blender is also, which is the design tool for 3D, also lets people programming in this way. And what I think is really interesting is that if we think about the Web 2 era, where in order to make content, you think about Web 1, right? Like think about the design systems for Web 1. In order to get good at Web 1 and make content, you needed to learn HTML, which was free and accessible, but required coding. CSS, free and accessible, but required coding. And Photoshop, which was expensive software and required getting good with technical skill. And we also did not have YouTube University to teach that to us for free yet. So you had to take classes. Like I took classes in Photoshop to get good at it. And then in Web 2, to make video content, it was YouTube was just being built, right? So there were some people teaching how to use YouTube on YouTube, but you had to get good at Adobe Premiere, which also wasn't free software. It was expensive software, required a lot of skill in order to edit the videos. And the interesting thing is for Web 3, we have YouTube teaching people. We also have Blender, which is open source software for 3D graphics. So there's really like the barriers to entry are getting lower and lower to get good. Now you can learn Blender for free on YouTube without investing any money, which means that the quantity of the user generated content is going to go up, but also the quality of the user generated content is going to go up because of the learning curve shrinking for getting good, because you can access the content, you can access templates, and YouTube's algorithm surfaces the best videos to the top. So I think that really is very interesting on a learning standpoint for Web3.
This is so exciting topic. I think it's also a very timely topic, right? Because we're really going through this shift in terms of the platforms and the economy as well, that like you really see it across the board how independent creators are taking over, right? Traditional media, like they're kind of losing steam. Obviously, yes, they still have a lot of viewers because it's the last past generation of people that are still watching TV, etc. But the Gen Z, and it's going to be about the next generation. And those people, they're not really going to be watching TV. They're going to be watching different types of media. They're going to be creating content. They're going to be watching different kind of influencers, celebrities, or whatever we're going to be calling them in the future. And it's actually so crazy interesting. One crazy example obviously is Mr. Beast, and then you have all these different creators, like even just the All In podcast, right? Like everybody is kind of listening to it now, and like they grew within a year from like a no-name podcast or just like a couple thousand people listening, and now they're taking over the charts. And obviously it's because, as you said, the tools to create amazing content are just getting much more accessible, and you can literally record from anywhere and you don't have to be in a studio anymore. But at the same time, like the platforms and just the appetite of people is different, right? And so I think with all of these changes, even what you're saying, Blender, all of these tools basically being accessible for free for people to use, it's going to unleash this next wave of creators and artists. And not just artists, right? Like artists are going to create art that's going to be a piece of it, but like just creating like different kinds of experiences, right? Like you can create games, all of these different things. And so this is really exciting. Plus, Web3, obviously, and there's a lot of love and hate, but with NFT technology, with the blockchain technology, now you even have a way to better incentivize these creators, right? And these people, and like really make sure that what they create is truly theirs. And you can verify that it was created by them at this time on this blockchain, etc. And so this is really exciting, man. And I would love to get your perspective on like, obviously what you guys are doing with Shaderverse and which kind of direction you're going into and why you're so bullish on that specific direction, be it artists or be it gaming or whatever else that you guys are focusing on.
Yeah. So I think it goes back to, if you remember, like as a kid playing with toys, right? I had a ton of action figures when I was a kid. I had like He-Man, I had G.I. Joe, I had Lego minifigures, Star Wars figures, everything, right? You could take all these toys out of a bin. You could put them in the same bin. You could mix them up. You could stage all these different crossovers where like Luke Skywalker and teamed up with Cobra Commandos to attack Castle Grayskull. You could do all of that stuff, and maybe the pieces wouldn't fit all together. Like you couldn't put a lightsaber inside of a He-Man action figure's grip because they were different sizes, but you could mostly make these toys work together. And also importantly, like you could trade them with friends. You could say like, oh, I want to trade you. I'll lend you 3 action figures if you lend me Excitebike for a Nintendo. And you could swap back and you could throw in a couple baseball cards in there. You had this interoperability. You had the ability to kind of make these marketplace deals with the kids in your class, right? Which, I mean, I was doing that from the time I was 6 years old, making these types of swaps and deals with friends. And I learned a lot about business just by doing that. So I think there's a real economy that develops naturally of people wanting to make trades with each other. And if you don't even think about these kind of technical things like NFTs and blockchain, you don't need NFTs and you don't need a blockchain to support making trades from content that goes into games. What you do need is you need a way for the file formats to be interoperable, like something that works in a game needs to also be able to be displayed in a marketplace and needs to also be able to be displayed in wherever else people want to interact with the content. Like if they want to actually like 3D print a sword that they earned in a game, something like that. So that's like the most, at the nuts and bolts, that's the most important thing in our mind, is that the content formats need to be able to, like, we need to be able to change file formats. We need to be able to break things down to a component level and reassemble everything back to a full action figure or full whatever, if that's going to be displayed on a marketplace. And then some people we're working with, even like web3 companies that have released NFT collections, they're like, all right, well, we just need this content out for our community. So we're not going to release that as an NFT. We just want to make it a download that they get, right? Sometimes they use centralized storage. Sometimes they use decentralized storage. It's kind of like pick the best tool and the best platform for the content. The content is really the most important thing. But what we think about a lot and what's really important is that when you're dealing with thousands of files, thousands of assets, you can't do these conversions by hand. You have to have a way to be able to run batches of them ahead of time, or even like do them on demand if the user gets to configure something, or if you're having content that's going to evolve over time. So we've basically been building out systems that can automate these. So when you have this content and you're dealing with thousands of different files, you need to have a way to be able to generate it very like semi-automatically. If you're running a batch, you want to get a batch of it done, or if you're doing it on demand, as content might evolve over time, you want to be able to do it and be able to deploy it in your infrastructure so that it can essentially run without, once you set up a project, it can run without the involvement of a technical professional that's like going in there and running these conversions by hand or manipulating content by hand. And that's how you're able to support content in a game and content on a marketplace and content that people can trade. So that's really what we've been doing, is building out those types of systems that these game companies can deploy on their own infrastructure. That opens up the gate for them to be able to support more content and user-generated content, and the next level of what we can see within these experiences, where people can really have these kind of crossover type situations where different characters make it into the same game. So that we want to see that come to life, like the toy playing experience that we had when we were kids come to life inside 3D games.
I think this is fascinating, and I actually want to go a little bit deeper into this topic, because there are two things that I would like to unpack. First is the technological side of things. Basically, you're building a platform to allow, let's say, an example, I am Bored Ape Yacht Club, I am building my assets, NFTs, whatever, own game, let's say. And then, because you're the owner of the NFT, there are some assets created and you want to take it into a different game that is built on a different blockchain, for instance. So the tool that you're building is that you're going to be able to take the files from Bored Ape Yacht Club, decode them into those, let's say, the core components, and then reassemble them on a different blockchain or a different environment. Is that correct? Is that technologically what is the end goal? Something that needs to be built so that we can actually end up in this world, that this kind of like taking one character, one IP, one NFT from one world to another can actually become a reality?
So what's interesting is that when it comes to the files, like every NFT for the most part is chain agnostic. So the content is stored usually not on chain, especially for 3D files, because they're larger files. So they're either stored in regular AWS S3 file storage, which is just like, hey, this is static files that are hosted somewhere in the cloud in the internet, right? So essentially, when you have an NFT, if it's a 2D file or a 3D file, most of the times the graphics are not stored on the specific blockchain. They're either stored, like they're hosted in AWS, they're hosted sometimes on IPFS, which is a decentralized file storage, and sometimes on Arweave. And then in very rare cases, the graphics, if it's really small, you can store it on chain. Like, for example, the CryptoPunks are stored on chain, but those are just like 24 pixels, I believe, by 24 pixels. So it's not a lot of data, like a few kilobytes or a few hundred bytes, right? But when you're dealing with 3D files, even if they're optimized, that's a megabyte or 2 megs or 3 megs. Way too expensive to store that on chain. You're much better off storing it someplace else. So if you think about that, if you think about the fact that these files aren't even stored on chain, they're just stored somewhere, what you really need to do is be able to have a way to access those files and then break them down into the component parts and then reassemble them. Because if you're making a game and you're distributing a game, you're not going to want to import all 10,000 of an asset. You're going to say like, okay, this comes in 150 different component parts. Let me just store all the 150 parts in the game, and then I'll know as the game developer how to assemble these based on the metadata of the character or of the shield. You want to be able to do that because it's much more efficient. So that becomes tricky, because if what you have is a fully assembled toy and then you're in charge of breaking it down into the parts, but you don't have the blueprint for making it, it's much more difficult than if you have the blueprint and the toy is just assembled in a way where you already know how to programmatically break it down. So what we do is, inside of Blender, we wrote an add-on that helps the artist organize the file to make generative art, organize their Blender project to make generative art, all without coding, and that's open source. And then we have infrastructure that turns this Blender project, if you follow our design patterns, it turns this Blender project into an API endpoint that can then be deployed on a Docker container. So this is like all technical DevOps infrastructure stuff, but basically the Blender project itself becomes a factory for generating these types of files that we can then customize. So you're going from, like, think about a factory in Shenzhen. You have these molds for making things, and then you can run the factory to produce a lot of things and you can distribute it everywhere. Imagine all that, like a toy factory making all the different parts, but it's all digital, right? And you can deploy, you can run it locally, you can run it in the cloud somewhere. So I think that gives a lot of flexibility for these game companies that want to be able to make different parts and then also have crossover games where maybe He-Man is holding the lightsaber. You know what I mean? Maybe because you can just put it in the hand and you can say, okay, now He-Man, I just want you to close your hand around that lightsaber. It's not made of plastic anymore. It's 3D graphics. You can change that, right? Because it's not a physical good. You can manipulate it programmatically. So I think the opportunities there for having types of crossover games in Web3, those are very exciting because crossovers are a lot of fun.
100%, man. I think this is super exciting. I think another thing that comes to my mind that is going to be a trouble or something that has to be solved, and I kind of understand that's at least partially what you're building. And I do believe that even the platform that you guys are building will have to be some sort of open sourced, right? Because how do you kind of push companies that are creating their own IP to use a standardized system to create these characters or to create these like different, I guess, data sets that can be then used and basically be taken away from one world and brought to another, right? I think that's going to be a huge challenge that this industry has to overcome or figure out, because otherwise everybody's going to be kind of building their own stuff. Everybody's going to be building on the top of their technology. But obviously, how do you connect those two things, right? Like that's going to be super hard, even harder than when you have some sort of standardized layer that, let's say, okay, you want to create a 3D kind of art based on your NFT. You control the design as an IP owner, because I think better example maybe than Bored Ape Yacht Club here is Nike Clone X, right? Because they already created these 3D models of all of their NFTs and they kind of control the basic design, how it looks, but then you can take it as a creator, as an owner, and you can place it in different environments. You can make videos, you can use it as avatar, etc. And that's basically what you want to do, but you want to kind of have it in a standardized form that you can bring it into a different world, into a different metaverse, into a different game. And so I believe that it all has to be open sourced and somewhat similar, standardized. Otherwise, it's not going to work, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's adoption from the artists, and artists adopt platforms when they believe that they're leveling up their skills and they can use it across projects, right? That's one of the reasons why we adopted an open source software policy for this is we wanted it to be zero friction for the artists. Here, it's just a Blender add-on. It's free. It's open source. You can use it for whatever. If you want to publish to games that support the Shaderverse infrastructure, great. If you want to take it and generate content for your own collections, it's great. Permissionless, do whatever you want with it. For us, I think that there's tremendous opportunity, and we've seen this in Web 2. If you have open source software that's on the infrastructure side, and the larger companies will need help integrating that into their infrastructure architecturally, getting it up and running. You're the experts. You can have integration teams that help them with that. For the smaller companies, there's an opportunity to do managed hosting. Hey, we're hosting it on our AWS cloud. You can spin up things. And then with Web3, the third, so you got version 1, version 2, and then version 3 is you can potentially, like we started this running on local workstations and using like latent processing power of the local workstations you had. So that's something that can be tokenized, and you can have a decentralized network of nodes that are running essentially Blender as a package, converting all these file formats, right? Instead of just totally running it on the cloud. So there's a lot of interesting opportunities to anyone starting an open source software company in this space. And I think that one of the things that's helping to drive everything in Web3 is the fact that things are open source and that there's really no risk to adopting startup technology if you're in an enterprise, if it's open source. If that startup goes away, you can keep running the systems because the systems are open source. So a lot of what you have to do as a startup is show social proof, minimize risk for people. So I think that open source software really helps drive that. So I'm a big fan.
You're really getting me excited about the future of this because many people mention this as a big problem. Many people think that if we don't have the solution for taking one IP from one world to another, that's basically going to limit the experience that you can have in the metaverse, right? Or in the metaverses. And to some extent, it's true. On the other hand, I spoke with another person just maybe a month ago, also on this podcast. They develop games and they raised a lot of money because they know it's going to take them maybe a couple of years to build the game because they really want to do it well. They're not just like building another game, but they want to build like a really amazing game, a lot of experiences, like economy built on the top of that to make sure that it's truly sustainable. And his point of view was that it actually doesn't matter. This interoperability doesn't matter so much. What matters even more is like, can you build games that are fun, that people enjoy, right? And that's the first stage. Like, can you actually create great content, great environment, and people will be drawn to that game because they enjoy that game, not because they can take the asset from that game and put it somewhere else, right? That's going to be the second stage. So if you have created an IP, if you have created a content that is amazing, people love it, and you create a brand, then you can take it to the next level and say, okay, now let's play around with these cross collaborations. Let's bring this character into another game and like, let's do some fighting with a completely different character in a different environment. And so I think it's the second phase for the space that, or even in terms of the priority for, let's say, gaming, right? But I totally understand what you describe, and I will let you chime in onto this, but you're not even talking about just building games, but you're talking about, hey, you can build these assets, these NFTs or whatever else it is, and you can kind of create a marketplace around it, right? What's your perspective on this? Which one comes first? Which one comes second? And like, where are we headed and where are we going to be in like 4 to 5 years from now?
So if you look at what's already happened in the Web 2 space, where the gardens were more walled in and what's worked, take Fortnite Travis Scott concert. For many teenagers, granted, this was during the pandemic, but I don't think that the pandemic necessitated this. For many teenagers, that was their first concert experience ever, right? And that was using the closed ecosystem of Fortnite, where Fortnite was they made the production, they made the spectacle of the environment. They made the deal with Travis Scott to get him to perform. I think they paid him some $20 million. And they did all of production for the visual effects of his show, which are spectacular. And then they also sold the skins and the emotes for how you could dance and what you wanted to wear to this concert. So I think that as the walls of that garden break down in Web3, there's a lot of opportunity for big brands to create the spectacle, right, where it needs major investment. And then for third parties, for user generated content, to allow for personalization and customization that can really reflect the uniqueness of everybody there. Because I mean, imagine you went to a concert in real life. Would you, or a nightclub or wherever, out to dinner, would you want to be dressed exactly the same as everybody else, or would you want to stand out? Like, how would you represent yourself in those experiences? And I don't believe in like that these experiences are going to be everything, but I consume a lot of content on Netflix when I'm at home. I consume content on podcasts when I'm driving, when I'm out, when I'm working out, whatever. There's content that we consume and interactive content that we participate in, depending on what we feel like doing on that day. So I think that this type of content has a place, but we still want to represent ourselves in a way that's appealing to us and that our friends will appreciate. So I just think yes, of course, it has to be fun. Of course, that's a given, right? That's like, if you look at the hierarchy of needs, people won't do it if it's not fun. But also, like, people have to be able to represent themselves.
I understand where you're coming from and why kind of like there's many different perspectives, like what matters more. I mean, ultimately, when I really simplify everything, I think what matters the most is really you need to build a brand of something first so that people want it, that there is attention, that there is a demand for it. And because there is this demand, then it's going to lead to the fact that people want to take one item and bring it to a different place, right? Or they want to customize it because there is attention, there is a demand, a lot of people want it. It's a symbol of status, whatever it is. And that will basically drive this kind of adoption of these new technologies and demand for these kinds of things, right? So that's why I think, yes, it's important. And when we talk about building a brand, that can be building a brand through making a game that is fun, that people really enjoy playing, right? So that's kind of like how I think about it. But I think long term, both of these things are super important to really build up this ecosystem that can feed itself.
Let me give you also another metaphor of how I think about it. Imagine the spectacle of organizing a conference. Like, you're going to organize Art Basel, you're going to organize South by Southwest. And that creates this spectacle that draws people in, and they're going to be in that physical location around the geography of Miami or Austin, Texas, or even like CES in Las Vegas. So you have that. Everybody shows up. Now, what makes it exciting is not the conference itself. It's that there's going to be all these people there that you want to interact with. And there's all these like little side events too that are very good, where you have a greater chance of bumping into people that are there that you want to meet with. Because if you go to a giant party, you're not going to meet everyone. If you go to a small dinner, a small party, you can meet some great people. So I think that's why I'm thinking about interoperability being so important, because you got to be able to have these side things in order for the big thing to make sense. If the big thing is just a spectacle that entails no interoperability, then no interaction, then that's not really that exciting. We already have ways of doing that, but when you can really have these smaller side things, that's when it gets interesting to me. Because that's just like, I get interested in that because that's been my own personal experience going to these big events over the years, is that the small things are where all the deals happen and where you make friends with people.
It's fascinating. How much time do you think we need to get to the level that there is going to be this kind of platform, and potentially you guys are building something that is going to be part of that solution? I believe that we need more than one, right? We need more people building something on that front, especially if we're talking about it being open sourced. We will need a lot of different companies and startups to be building that and utilizing that to really make sure that it touches as many people as it can. How much time do you think we need to really see something? First, we're going to have some games probably next year, maybe in 2 years, we're going to see some like AAA games that are related to blockchain technologies somewhat, that are going to take off and are potentially going to onboard a lot of new people? And then do you think it's going to take another 2-3 years from there to actually see some sort of like collaboration or crossovers between different games and different metaverses and different platforms? How do you look at it?
We have some projects that are in development that have been announced, that are shipping, that are going to entail crossovers, which I think will be exciting for people. I think the walls of the garden will gradually come down and people will be able to do more in terms of user generated content. So this project's been announced, so I can talk about it a little bit. There's a group, Jadu AR, that made hoverboards and avatars, and they're releasing an app, and they've announced partnerships with some of the web3 brands that were announced like last year in December of 2021 and have been under development. So Deadfellas and Jadu AR, Deadfellas is a PFP collection. They announced that they were going to be bringing some of the avatars into Jadu AR, and we've been helping them with that. And that's basically a year in development. So I think a lot of the projects, the time from when a project gets announced to when it gets launched is going to be about a year or so, maybe longer, depending on the complexity. And eventually that, as more templates get built and people understand the process better, the time and the assets are available to be used in different environments, then that time might shrink down a bit. But I think we'll start seeing some things come in 2023. We have a bunch in development and we're taking on more. So we want to help accelerate that. And I'm excited for this. And then, of course, once the project gets launched, as people can create like their own storylines inside of these worlds and create new economies in there. If it gets really interesting and exciting, I think that's going to encourage more people to get into the space, which is, in my opinion, is the more the merrier.
100%. And I think it's the same with all these different tools like DALL-E and the text to image. This really brings a lot more people into the creative world because now they can start experimenting. They can get excited because maybe before they didn't really think that they can be an artist, but now they can use machine to help them to become an artist. And I think obviously what you guys are doing, it's more 3D, VR, more like immersive type of content than just images. But ultimately, that's the goal you're going after, right? Like, is the goal, or how do you see it very practically speaking, because you guys are using Blender, and I haven't really played with Blender yet, but I do understand from a little bit of research that I've done that it's not as easy, it's not as straightforward as, let's say, creating a design in Canva, right? For, let's say, if you are a pseudo artist and you actually want to create something that looks good, you can do it just drag and drop and that's it. For Blender, that's not the case. Is it? Like, what's the barrier today, and where do you see the barrier going in the next 12 to 24 months?
The thing with Blender is like, it's almost like not like learning Blender that's challenging, but learning to think about things in 3D space that requires a little bit of a shift in your mind. And then like once people grasp thinking about something in 3D space, then they're able to work with the tools, because inside of 3D software that runs on your 2D screen, you're working with typical art tools. You might be like simulating modeling something out of clay and then picking at it with a knife when you're sculpting inside Blender, but you're also taking the camera and moving a virtual camera around to look at the item from different angles as you're building it, which is like a little bit of a shift that you have to do mentally. And I think that's the hardest part. So for people like architects or interior designers or anybody that comes from a traditional sculpting world, they can grasp it and the strategy of it, and then they just have to learn the tools. The way a project typically works is that you might start with concept art that has a front-facing view if you're making a character, a side view, a top view, a back view of the character, and then you're looking at that reference art after you've drawn it out, or some concept artist has drawn it out, and you're working with a model that can represent that shape. And there's generative tools now, like AI generative tools, that are still in the research science phase. NVIDIA just announced one like 2 days ago that can do text prompt to 3D images. And it's like the second paper in the space. The first paper did it in an hour and a half on like $80,000 worth of GPUs, which you can rent on AWS. It would cost you like maybe $50 to generate a single model off of a single prompt in an hour and a half of waiting. This version can do it in 40 minutes. So like $25 it would cost you if you were gonna pay AWS, which isn't really like something that you would put into production because you're gonna have to have maybe 10 experiments to get something good. I'm just guessing there. And like that would cost you $250. You might as well just pay someone to model it, right? But eventually, I think somebody will write a paper that will get that to run in like a reasonable amount of time on a gaming GPU that people have in their workstations. And then from there, it will start to get feasible that we might see some of these things in production and like running integrations into Blender. So I think that's really exciting because same thing for concept art, getting something into Blender that you can then start messing with is really interesting. So that's like one way you can get things in. There's also like procedurally generated content where if you work with simple geometry, you can modify that through parameters and get lots of different variations, which Blender already supports. And then there's also the idea that, well, maybe you don't need to learn all of Blender, but you can have a simple web interface that interacts with Blender on the back end to generate things. And in that way, you're just like choosing things from a drop down on your phone and interacting with Blender, interacting with content that people have already made. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to get more artists and more creators into the fold at the level in which they want to get into it. Truthfully, everything could be almost like a gateway drug into a layer down and getting like really deep. And eventually like, you're like, I've reached the limits of what this can do. I just want to get into it and start messing with things, around with things at the deepest levels. But you don't want to expose the deepest level to people all at once. But I think they should know they can get deeper, that there's no limit.
This is exactly what I was talking about at the beginning. I'm super bullish on these kinds of technologies. And obviously what you just mentioned, it kind of tells me that we're really going in the same direction, right? We started with simple designs and text to image, and now you can potentially make text to like simple videos, simple films, because I know, for instance, Grace from Crash Punks, right? She made pieces of her video using AI, right? And so based on what you're saying is something similar is coming to the 3D world as well. And we could potentially end up in a situation that actually you will have AI assisting you with kind of breaking the barrier even further for people that maybe don't have that skill set today, that 2D to 3D skill set, but they will be able to use AI or some tools that are being built to basically supplement and to skip over that obstacle in a sense. And again, that is going to lead to the fact that they will discover this world. And if they really get passionate about it, they can jump into it 100% and actually learn different pieces of that software and how it works and how you can actually do much more with it. So, man, I'm on the same page with you. I'm really super excited to see what's going to happen in this space. And I actually want to start playing around with some of these tools. Before I let you go, and we obviously need to do like a second version of this interview at some point when the technology is going to become more kind of out there and more accessible, because I think this is fascinating. What would you recommend people to do if they would like to start playing around? Would you recommend them to go to Blender, or would you recommend them to go to you guys or to specific applications? Or what would you say for somebody who has no idea what this is, but is excited to potentially play around with it? What do you think is the best first step for them?
So the hardest time that you'll ever spend in a software like Blender is your first 30 minutes, because it's just it's a big program. It's like, imagine being presented with Microsoft Word for the very first time. You're like, oh my goodness, there's so many menus and toolbar buttons. Like, what are all these? Do I need to learn all of them at once just to write a document? And the answer is no. They're there for you, but most people use such a small amount of features in the software. So I put together, there are a lot of people who've done this. I put together like a playlist of tutorials that I made. It's about 18 minutes long, the totality of it, and it's split into like 4 or 5 videos for your first 20 minutes in Blender. Just you've downloaded the software and here's your first 20 minutes. So we can link that in the podcast. I think that's a really great way to get started, is just like learning how to navigate around, how to work with things inside Blender. It's also the second thing that I would advise, and most Blender YouTubers advise this, is you got to get a mouse. Most people, if they're working on just a laptop with a touchpad, it's like you're really, maybe if you're a piano player and you've got like amazing like capabilities with your fingers, you can get around the software with just a touchpad, but it's so much easier if you use a mouse. So I would say everybody invest like $20, get a mouse with a scroll wheel and get the tutorials, and you'll have an easy time in Blender. Yeah, so that's like, it does, this is very important. But yeah, I mean, it's basically a great way to get started.
This has been great. I learned so many different things, and I'm super excited how this space is going to evolve, because I didn't really pay that much attention to this before, because again, that was the thing that like, I thought it's something that I will never be able to do because I'm not an artist. But after talking to you, I know that I could do something like that, or I could explore at least like playing around with it, because the tools exist and it's not as crazy as it used to be to actually get involved. One more thing, do you want to point people to a specific website or to your Twitter or any kind of link that you think would be helpful for them if they want to connect with you, if they want to learn about what you guys are doing, if they want to support you in any way, if you guys are onboarding artists, if those guys are interested, anything that you would like to mention before we wrap it up?
We're really easy to find. Michael Gold on Twitter. Our company is Shaderverse on Twitter. We're also shaderverse.com and Shaderverse on GitHub if you want to grab our Blender add-on. And thanks so much for hosting this. I can't wait to see you again in person. Hope you come hang with me in New York.
We got to do it sometime soon. I'm definitely going to be in the US next year because I'm already planning a bunch of conferences. Cannot miss out. And I'm sure that next year you guys are already going to be in a completely different position. And we're going to see so many exciting projects coming out of it. So, man, I'm super excited. Thanks so much for your time and keep building.
Yeah, man. Thanks. See you soon.